With our love for loose-fitting clothes that I can't speak myself free from, we often forget how clothes are used to create outstanding silhouettes. We know that it was done in the past, and there are a lot of amazing videos covering this, like this one from Evie, for example. But still, we don't really recognize it in modern fashion. It seems like we kind of forget that this is still done and is gaining a lot of popularity again. These dresses, for example, while looking simple, are doing this so good that they probably tricked a lot of people. So, today I thought we could make something similar. A simple dress that hides a structure that makes the body look almost unreal. Just so much that you don't know if it's real or not. Starting with the outside, I had a beautiful grey fabric I wanted to use for the dress. I decided to make the dress itself as simple as possible to really accentuate the silhouette. To achieve this shape, we are starting off with the form-fitting corset with foam cups. On this we will then build up the shape we want to achieve in the end. For dresses with a built-in corset, it is especially important that the pattern fits perfectly. Otherwise you can see the corset from the outside, or it won't improve the shape but make the dress look dented. Since for my mannequin building video I made a pattern that fitted really good, I'm going to use it for this project as well. So the first step was to transfer the pattern so I can work on it without destroying the original one. For this I made sure the pattern and the tracing paper wouldn't shift, and then I started to draw over all the lines. Even though I wanted a low back on the new pattern, I still traced all the way up. This way it is a lot easier if I ever want to go back and change something about the style or size. After tracing the base pattern, I could directly start to draw the new shape onto it. This is possible since I know the base pattern already fits, so I don't need a mock-up in between. I added the lines for the cups, drew in the neckline and lowered the back as mentioned earlier. Otherwise I didn't have to change anything. After tracing the lines with a dark marker to make them more visible and writing down the date, I could then transfer it onto the mock-up fabric. Even though I knew the base pattern fits, I wanted to be 100% sure that the changes I made weren't interfering with the fit, and everything looked the way I wanted it to look. Another thing that made to measure and couture dresses can achieve is taking the body that will later wear the dress into consideration. Every proportion is different and every body can be shaped to a different extent, regardless of how big or small it is. For the mock-up I'm using zip ties as boning, since they are less expensive and strong enough to give the right shape over the fitting period. A fitting without boning wouldn't work because the mock-up wouldn't behave like the corset later. With the first mock-up finished, I can show you now what I mean by taking the individual body into consideration. My ribs end about here, while my hips already start there. This makes it almost impossible to take the waist in a bit more, since it would look weird and there is simply not enough space for a smooth reduction. But this is no problem at all, because the body is only the starting point and we can build the shape we want to achieve starting from here. So instead of building a corset that reduces the waist, we have to work with what we got and build onto it. I was very happy with the fit of the mock-up, and so I directly started on the actual corset. For this we need a few special materials. First of all, starting with the thin netting fabric. I want the corset and understructure to be as light as possible, so this is the perfect choice. If you want to make a corset like this for yourself, make sure that the fabric is not stretchy, or at least not in the direction you want to use it. Next up we got a bra foam. This is actually the first time I'm using this type of foam for a dress. Then we need our boning. For the real corset we use plastic boning, which is still flexible but stronger than cable ties. Then we need a little bit of the fashion fabric for the parts of the corset that could be seen from the outside. A lot of twill tape in different sizes. And our other sewing supplies, including eyelets for the back of the corset. Since I haven't done those kind of cups before, I start with them. I drew all the cup parts onto the foam and cut them out using a rotary cutter. Because when using scissors, the foam sometimes made it stick together somehow, so I cut it this way. Then all the parts are sewn together with a zigzag stitch while pressing the edges directly against each other. Then I sewed some twill tape over the seams. With some scraps of the foam I made some padding for the cups by cutting out a few layers and sewing them together. Those are then sewn into the cups by hand with a loose stitch. After sewing the cups, I cut out the same pattern pieces from a lining fabric and sewed them together. Then I added the lining into the cup and finished the top with a bit of the fashion fabric. This was a bit unnecessary because the dress will later cover the edge of the cup. But at this point I wasn't sure how I wanted to finish the neckline, so I did it this way. With the cups finished, I could then cut out the corset pieces from the net fabric. Here I used the rotary cutter again because pinning the fabric distorted the pattern pieces too much, and tracing the pattern wasn't possible because the fabric moved too much. So I laid the net fabric onto my mat, held the pattern in place and then cut around it. The pattern pieces here were made with the seam allowance already added. Only the center back panels were made using the dress fabric, reinforced with some interfacing. Here I could trace around the pattern piece and cut it out with scissors. After I had all the corset pieces cut out, I started to sew them together. Since I hadn't marked the seam allowance on the net pieces, I made sure I moved my needles so that I could use my foot to measure the 1 cm from the edge. Then I sewed the pieces together, always sewing 2 pieces at a time and ironing the seam allowance to one side in between. When all the pieces were sewn together, I added the boning channels. I used small twill tape and sewed it onto the side of the seam to which I ironed the seam allowance before. Now it was time to add the cups to each side of the corset. Since I didn't have one of those wires to add underneath, I improvised a bit and ironed some softer boning in the right shape. Then I sewed it directly under the cup and hid it with the twill tape. Then I had to make back panels that contained the lacing. First I sewed the front and back together and turned it inside out. While ironing, I made sure that the pattern piece from the inside isn't visible from the outside. Because of the eyelets that will be added here, I already added the boning at this point. For this, I cut it the right length and ironed it flat. Then I sanded the edges smooth and added it into the back panels. With 2 rows of boning done in the center back, I could then add the eyelets in between. The finished back panels are then added to the rest of the corset. After all panels are sewn together, I sewed a wider twill tape to the waist on the inside. This is to distribute the pull at the waist evenly and to reinforce the corset there. Then I added the final boning channel over the end of the waistband. The last step on the corset was then to add all the boning. For this, I first cut all the different boning pieces and labeled them. It's important to have them the right length, and this way I wouldn't mix them up. Then I ironed them flat and added them into the right boning channel. Now we can look at the fit of the corset for the first time. I added temporary straps because the whole dress will get straps in the end. I like the look and fit of the corset a lot. It fitted snugly all the way around and had the perfect tightness for my taste. It would have been possible to make the corset even tighter around the waist to reduce it more, but I personally don't handle tightness around the waist too good. And since we are making a dress that not only fits my measurements but also my needs, I decided against it. Then it was time to work on the hip extension. The one we are making is maybe comparable to some kind of panier. For this, we will take the pattern of the lower half of the corset and expand the circumference of the hips evenly. To make it possible for me to trace it onto the netting fabric later, I made new pattern pieces for each panel. Then I cut them out from the fabric like I did with the corset panels before. Again, I sewed all the pieces together, making sure to leave the correct seam allowance. And then ironed said seam allowance to one side again on each seam. The difference to the corset is now that I used softer boning I could directly sew onto the fabric. I added the boning to each seam as well as across the hips. With another twill tape added as a waistband, I could then sew the whole hip extension to the corset. To secure it, I sewed it by hand to each boning channel around the waist and at a few places at the bottom. I really liked the look of all the different boning channels across over each other on the transparent layers. I briefly tried it on again to check if I liked the volume the hip panel gave the bottom of the corset. I already liked the shape of it a lot, and so I could then go on to finally make the dress. Sewing the dress was very easy. I used the skirt of a dress I made before and only had to cut the pattern pieces off the top. For this, I had the corset pattern altered slightly to create long panels that I know had to transfer onto the fabric and add the correct seam allowance. Then I cut all the panels and sewed them together. Again, I sewed 2 pieces together at a time and ironed each seam carefully before sewing the next panels together. After finishing the top, I added the skirt to it and closed the center back using an invisible zipper. To finish the top of the dress and the corset, I still had to make the straps. I wanted to make them as thin as possible while still being able to hold the heavy dress. For this, I first cut strips of the bias from the fabric. I sewed them together to get one longer strip. Then I pressed the seams and cut the seam allowance. To reinforce the strap, I wanted to add a thin cord. Since the cord had to be pulled into the strip and I had nothing small enough to pull it, I sewed it in a loop to the beginning of the strip and then closed the fabric around it. Then I could pull the cord through the strap, using itself to turn it the right way around as well. And then it was time for the finishing touches. I sewed the straps onto the dress by hand all the way around the neckline and then finished the inside of the dress at the front and arm's eye. And this is the final dress. A simple dress that totally hides the amount of construction that lays beneath it. I think especially from further away the effect is very nice. For me it could have been a bit more subtle, but for the sake of this video the dress turned out perfect. Even though the corset is tight, the dress is very comfortable and nice to wear. It also feels very secure all around. In the end, I want to highlight that with making this dress, I don't want to say this is the perfect silhouette or this is how one has to look. I simply wanted to show what is possible to achieve through dressmaking, so that in the future you look at couture dresses with a bit more knowledge maybe. I hope you liked today's video, and if you did, feel free to like it and subscribe to my channel. Until next time.